All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show my old friend Kurt Couchman, Senior Fellow in Fiscal Policy at Americans for Prosperity, and the author of this excellent new book, Fiscal Democracy in America, How a Balanced Budget Amendment Can Restore Sound Governance. Welcome to Free the Economy, Kurt.
Well, thank you for having me. Glad to be back.
All right, so I'm going to hassle you a little bit at the beginning. So I've been hearing about big budget deficits at the federal level since I was a kid. I was kind of a weird kid. I paid attention to the news. Plenty of people in politics since even the 80s and into the 90s have been talking about the need to get spending under control in Washington, D.C. We're going to avert a fiscal crisis. And yet here we are decades later in 2025. Look, we're the strongest and most prosperous country in the world. We have macroeconomic indicators like GDP growth, employment, and inflation that, well, maybe not amazing, it's pretty decent and better than a lot of our peer countries. So some observers might say that we're chugging along just fine as it is. So is our long-term public debt really that much of a problem?
It is a problem. And you're right that there are a lot of things that are going very well for America and for Americans. But there is this eroding of our foundations of prosperity that is going on. There are a number of countries that thought that things were going along pretty well, and then the debt will eventually catch up with them. We've seen some jittery bond markets. We've seen some yellow flashing signs. Some would say red flashing signs about the willingness of bond buyers to continue purchasing federal debt. And if we don't get a hold of this, then we could face a debt crisis. We've already experienced high inflation, high interest rates. Part of that came from a federal government that has been spending and borrowing too much. Mm-hmm. It's now crowding out investments in productivity boosting, plant and capital and equipment and all those things. So we're experiencing those things right now. Even setting aside the debt crisis. But the biggest deficit that we have might be a deficit in democracy within Congress among the things that we actually need Congress to do, which is a smaller set than what they're actually doing. But the hope is that fiscal responsibility is one of a number of things that also spurs Congress to reinvent itself so that it can be more representative of the American people and solve more problems.
Well, yeah, and I want to get into just for a minute this angle about bond buyers and financial markets and how that's a signal that our country or maybe some other peer countries are spending too much money. So this has come up a bunch of times, but I've heard people mention it really in recent weeks and months about the so-called bond vigilantes, the idea that there's big financial players out there. And one of the things that they often put their money in is government bonds, especially U.S. government bonds, usually considered to be pretty safe investments. And that, like you alluded to, the lack of enthusiasm for those usual financial players to buy more government debt is a big warning sign because they're worried that they might not get paid back or that there might be a default, and that would shake the confidence of the entire U.S. economy and global financial system. But when it comes to, again, that phrase that has been used sort of sometimes semi-facetiously, bond vigilantes, the idea that, a handful of investment professionals are, kneecapping the ability of governments to spend when they really need to spend, right? That the idea that it's come up in the UK, certainly, that usually more people from people on the left side of the spectrum who would say, oh no, it's really important. The government needs to spend all this money on these important public goods. But these penny pinching, lords of finance are tripping up the process by, not wanting to buy the bonds or spreading negative vibes about whether, government bonds are good investments or not. But isn't that one, the least bad thing anyone could be doing is just saying, you know what, that investment's not for me. They're not sabotaging the government by saying, I don't want to buy that thing. But again, but also, isn't that also kind of a financial hygiene measure? Shouldn't we be wanting to know that reticence? And doesn't that tell us something?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are lots of people with fantasies about what the government should do, what the government can do, and it's good to have a reality check from time to time, whether it's from elections or whether it's from the bond markets saying, hey, what you're doing isn't working, you need to do something different. And it's true, we have used up an awful lot of fiscal space by spending and borrowing recklessly, I would add. And for the bond markets to say that's not a good bet for us right now, that should be a wake-up call. And there's a lot of people in this town that don't want to hear that. They just want to keep doing, what they thought they were going to be able to get away with doing. And I think it's good just to say, wait a minute, what are you doing? This doesn't make sense. Do something different. And I mean, the idea that you borrow during emergencies does make sense. That's part of fiscal responsibility. And that's part of the reason why you need to keep the debt burdens low during the good times so that when the bad times come, whether it's a recession or a natural disaster or war or whatever, that you have the space to be able to go to the bond markets and borrow. But we haven't been doing the responsible thing during the good years. And so, when the bad years come, we're kind of overexposed, and that's not good, but it's a sign that we need to get our house in order.
Yeah, that kind of classic balance, the idea that you borrow in emergencies and you save up in good times. The U.S. federal government has been so good at that first half, but not so good at the second half, it seems like. So you are obviously not coming at this problem as someone who has just started noticing it recently. Book talks in detail about probably at least 15 years or so. You've been going back. You've been working on this as a congressional staffer in the think tank advocacy world. So, the title of the book references the Balanced Budget Amendment, something that, again, the book describes in detail. There's a lot of history there among people wanting there to be an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that does call for, does require a balanced budget. But you also acknowledge that this is going to be a big lift. Any constitutional amendment, by definition and by design, is difficult to enact, and it's complicated, and a lot of people have tried and failed in the past. Why do we need a constitutional amendment and not any one of a number of other budget and policy reforms that would be targeted in the same direction?
It's yes, and we need a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution because constitutional provisions are beyond the ability of Congress to change or ignore at will. There's a lot of moral staying power that provisions of the Constitution have. Look at the First Amendment, look at any number of provisions in the Constitution, and you see that there is an obligation or a restriction or an empowerment that Congress has to deal with, and the American people will call members of Congress on that. So it is really important to have the constitutional provision, and it's also really important to have the statutory institutions that can make it possible for Congress to reach balance, to involve all members, to do lots of different things. And that's what the last couple of chapters talk about, the direct implementing legislation for the balanced budget amendment. The BBA that I talk about in the book is what we call a principles-based balanced budget amendment, in that it's like existing provisions of the Constitution, a handful of basic principles that actually leave a lot more questions than answers. And then you need to have the details, the mechanics specified in statute, and then have enforcement that works, a couple of different flavors of enforcement so they all reinforce each other. But then you need to have a congressional budget process that is also functional, and we don't have that right now. The biggest issue we have is that Congress doesn't actually do a budget. They do appropriations bills, and those are great. There's 12 of them. Collectively, they're about $1.8, $1.9 trillion. But the federal government is spending $7 trillion, not counting the trillion or so in true tax expenditures. And most of that spending, actually 3/4 of that spending, is not part of the appropriations process. Revenue and the tax expenditures are not part of the appropriations process, and the appropriations process really only involves the Appropriations Committee in both houses. So if you want to manage the budget, you have to manage the whole budget, and you have to empower the committees that have jurisdiction over the different pieces of the budget to manage their pieces of it and then bring it all together into one bill. And for the purpose of balance, you need to have all those different dials that you can turn so that you can make the political deals to get you to balance and be able to sustain that balance commitment over the indefinite future.
Right. So there's a lot of complex angles that would go into Congress doing annual budgeting. One, in a way that makes sense, that it's supposed to be doing, but that would be like balanced at the end of the day as well. So it's difficult to compare Congress now to how we want it to work because there's only one Congress. There's not like an alternate universe where we can see like, Congress 2.7A. But we do have 50 states in this country. And so we always like to look to the states for good ideas here on the show because we certainly don't think policymakers at the federal level have all of the answers, if indeed it seems at times whether they have any at all. And you mentioned, some of these state processes in the book and, the systems they use, including a state like Colorado that comes up a lot in these conversations, which has something called the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. People call it TABOR, which kind of sounds like an evil robot from the future. So talk about how state spending, one, is different from federal spending, right? In sort of an important way. And then how that the difference between how states do their budgets can inform what you want to see with Congress at the federal level.
One of the defining features of state budgeting is that they are actually restrained by bond markets. There is interjurisdictional competition between the states, and institutional investors don't need to invest in the bonds of any particular state. They can move things around. The other thing is that the bond markets have forced the states to adopt restraint. They pretty much all have some sort of a balance rule. 49 of the states, Vermont's the only one that doesn't have a formal rule of some sort for balance, but they're not all constitutional rules. Some are just statutory, some are just constitutional. Most are constitutional and statutory, which is what I propose for the federal government. So that's kind of the model. You look around, you see what works, and it turns out that it's not just states, it's also other countries that have done things that are worth taking a look at. Switzerland has the Swiss debt brake, which again is a constitutional balance rule, and then there's statutory implementing legislation. The key with all of these things is the states and then the various other countries that have good rules. They didn't just come up with them and say, hey, this is a good idea, we should do that. They got into trouble. And then part of getting out of trouble was to have credible commitments in their constitutions and their statutes that they're going to turn things around. So it was a combination of policy changes, spending restraint, which has been the most effective, and then in some cases revenue increases as well, which is not an ideal component, but sometimes for political deals it has to be there. And then having the better rules of the game so that they actually are responsible for the longer term. And there are great benefits from that. I mean, you look around and you see that the states that have actually been fiscally responsible have lower effective interest costs that they have to pay, not only because the debt burden is lower,
right,
but also because they're getting more preferential terms, lower interest rates on whatever they are actually borrowing.
Yeah, especially the comparison to other countries reminds me of a conversation we had a few episodes back with Romina Boccia of the Cato Institute. She and her colleague had a book out recently about Social Security reform. Again, which, solving the federal budget crisis and solving Social Security reform, two giant, complex, heavy lifts that are, if they're successful, will probably go hand in hand. And she pointed out a bunch of mostly good stories from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, countries all around the world, but also made the point you just made now, which is that most of these countries they don't have good systems now because they were always virtuous. They're basically like drug users who are in recovery, right? Mm-hmm. They hit bottom and then they sort of clawed their way back out of necessity. And that's an angle that I think comes up a lot in whether it's members of Congress themselves or pundits and think tankers and people like us saying, "Look, what's the possibility that Congress is going to fix this in good times, and what's the possibility that we're going to come razor close to things falling apart before we fix it,
or beyond,
or an actual real things meltdown crisis." Do you think that plausible scare stories will fire the imagination of decision makers before it actually happens?
I'd like to believe that. Truth is, I've moved away a little bit from talking about things in the scary terms. There's that old saying that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. What I've found in being a deficit hawk, a fiscal responsibility advocate, is that members do care about that, and their staff care about that, but it's sort of a jumble of different things that they care about to varying degrees. And they're very responsive to what they're hearing from their colleagues and from the people they represent. But it doesn't do enough to move them to act most of the time. And I think one of the things that's going on is something that was said very well by then Congressman Tom Reed from New York when he told a well-known advocate of fiscal responsibility, "We know what we need to do. We don't know how to do it and survive." And so you have to have a policy-making system that empowers legislators to make tough but necessary decisions while also giving them the right kinds of political cover. Now, there are bad kinds of political cover. We don't want those. But we do want there to be a series of bipartisan deals to make it possible for them to do things. And what's interesting about that is that the goal isn't necessarily fiscal responsibility. The goal is helping members of Congress succeed as legislators, helping them matter, right? Nobody wants to run for Congress so that they can be a rubber stamp. They think they're going to get here and they're going to make a big difference. And which is why we've seen some great members decide to pack it up and go do something else because they just feel like they can't make a difference in the institution of Congress as we know it. So if you're able to find some things that empower members and give them something to believe in terms of service in Congress, then incidentally, if that is fiscally responsible or drives fiscally responsible results, then you've got something. And I think that's what the comprehensive budget proposal is really all about, because you're empowering them and restraining them at the same time. And a balanced budget amendment, the right kind that can pass, is not only about fiscal responsibility, but it's also about catalyzing Congress to fix itself, to do the things institutionally that will make members matter more and empower them to become the legislators that they are perfectly capable of being and actually often want to be.
Yeah, and I feel like the idea of members of Congress becoming sort of disenchanted with how dysfunctional it is and like wanting to leave and go to something else. Obviously, it's easy to sort of become a lobbyist or join a corporate board or do something that can actually make you a little bit of money. But I think sometimes about the dynamic of state office versus federal office. On one level, there's a sort of political status associated with being in Washington, D.C. People think that's the big leagues. That's where you want to be. But man, if you were like the most junior U.S. senator versus being the governor of your state, you're a lot more effective on a day-to-day basis. And I would imagine it's a lot more fun to be the guy in the governor's office. So you can see where those incentives are. And the problem there is not that some people come and some people go, but I feel like the most principled people who want to do the most good are the people who are pushed away the fastest by the dysfunction.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. But, a lot of members of Congress are high energy people that are sort of restless spirits by nature. They want to do something that makes an impact in people's lives. And if they get to Congress and they find out that it's just not doing it, then they're going to look for other opportunities to do that. And there are lots of different places in our society where you can make a meaningful contribution. So, yeah, people will move on.
Yeah, and the point you make about bipartisanship, which is, the proposal that we should have a better budget process, that we should have a balanced budget amendment, that we should have like a budget that actually makes sense and takes is cognizant of all of our spending, is about it's about Congress working better as an institution, and obviously that is something that is bipartisan, right? Every member needs to be involved in an institution that actually works how it's supposed to. And one point I think you really kind of hammer home in the book, and it'll no doubt be useful for many of our friends in the policy world to think about, is that something like a constitutional amendment can't be done to the advantage of just one party or just one ideological group. I'm sure we both know plenty of people who would love structural limits on spending because they want erratically smaller federal government, which is great. I'd be part of that group, but if we try and make a constitutional amendment that's just for libertarians only, then it probably won't get very far.
That's right.
Right. And so so the question is, how do we attract Democrats and left center people to this cause? One, and I would say, just as a premise to that, one, that seems hard because Congress is more polarized than ever. Even, the political scientists with their charts can show you that, even though it's conventional wisdom too. So that seems like it would be difficult. But on the other hand, the polling for balanced budgets is like perennially like 70% of the public. So on that other seems, or even higher, depending on how you phrase it. So maybe it's not that hard.
Well, the public is there, but the mechanics take some engineering. You're talking about the BBA that can appeal to libertarians. So Senator Mike Lee had a book that came out in, I think, 2011 about the Freedom Balanced Budget Amendment or something like that. And he talked about the 5 things that it must include. And yeah, they're all limited government, constitutional conservative catnip. But that's the issue. Like, it appeals to probably not even all Republicans, let alone the 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of state legislatures or conventions in 3/4 of the states, that you need to actually get a constitutional amendment proposed and then ratified. So you have to be thinking about the process when you're thinking about the policy and the politics of it all. The push for balanced budgets, balanced budgets, even setting aside the amendment, that has not historically been a partisan issue. Republicans and Democrats have both been pushing for that. Thomas Jefferson wished it were possible to, prevent or to add an amendment to the Constitution to prohibit borrowing by the federal government. Now, it makes sense for the federal government to borrow sometimes. We did it during President Jefferson's tenure to buy the Louisiana Purchase, and that was a great investment, worth doing. Even like during the Great Depression, when we had peacetime debts that were growing, it was a Democrat from Maryland who was the first one to say, "Hey, we should have a resolution saying that we should balance the budget." And then the next year, 1936, a Minnesota Republican offered the first true balanced budget amendment to the Constitution proposal. But then it was bipartisan the whole way through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, only really started to change in the 90s when the Gingrich Revolution, the Contract for America, grabbed hold of it. But even then, broad bipartisan support, it actually passed the House 300 to 132 in 1995 and fell one vote short in the Senate, with a number of Democrats supporting it as well. So we do have to get that back. It has become something that has been more Republican coded, but it's not. It is a tool for good governance. It is a management structure where Congress can do whatever it wants to. It just has to be willing to raise the revenue for whatever spending it wants to do. And that's just it's the PAYGO principle that Democrats have championed, but at the point of balance. So it's not a radical concept at all, but we do need to start rebuilding the bipartisan support for that. Part of it is having the proposal not have anything offensive in there to anyone's sensibilities. So it's simply, balance the budget, which can happen over more than 1 year. It doesn't even have to be the full balance. It can be primary balance. So that's current programmatic spending versus revenue. You can exclude the interest costs if you like. That's up to implementing legislation. A simple 2/3 for emergencies, which has not been a problem historically, except when leadership has decided that they wanted to maximize benefits to constituencies, and then a reasonable transition to get to balance. We're so far from it right now. We think 10 years is a reasonable time to get at least a primary balance, and then we can figure out what to do after that, again, through the normal process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. Looking back to some of the instances in American history, like you just mentioned, like during the Great Depression, where you would expect it, that's a time when, in a crisis, the federal government would have been expected to borrow and spend more to deal with that. There's fascinating work from David Beto, who's a historian at the University of Alabama, and he's written several books about that era. His new biography of FDR that came out, but he had a book like 30 years ago, I think, that was about tax revolts during the 1930s and during the New Deal era, and how, yes, it was a time when some people expected the federal government to spend more to deal with crisis, but it was also a time when there was huge grassroots opposition to increases in taxes. That was maybe was a little would be unexpected to some people, and it was sort of fascinating. And even in 1932, I was just reading David's new book about FDR, in 1932, the Democratic platform called for fiscal responsibility first. It called for a 25% reduction in federal government spending. Wow. That is what FDR in 1932 made campaign speeches on. So if there's bipartisanship, right? Mm-hmm. If we could get the FDR from the 1932 campaign back in office, we could really get this whole like balanced budget thing going forward. So one other issue, which you sort of mentioned, is as we've gotten here, is the difference between when it comes to like, well, how do you draft this? What does it look like? Some people who are most concerned about wanting a balanced budget, and we want a balanced budget amendment that is rock solid, that's like clad in adamantium, that cannot be gotten around, and that wanted to cover every imaginable way that Congress might kind of weasel out of it. They would want a very aggressive, complicated, formula to say you can't do this and you have to do this, you have to do it this way. Mm-hmm. But you point out that that's not really how constitutional amendments have been written in the past, and there's any number of reasons why that like probably wouldn't work. That you should have, like you said, sort of principles based. You should have like a general principle, and then leave it up to Congress to write the details later, because that's kind of, some people would say, well, they'll just water it down. It's like, well, but that might be the only way it happens at all. So talk about why your constitutional amendment should be really short. Mm-hmm. And then the other stuff that makes sure it gets done can be more complicated.
Yeah, there are a couple of different angles on this one. So first of all, the existing provisions of the Constitution are almost entirely principles. You think about any of the powers that Congress has under Article 1, Section 8, to raise and support armies. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, Congress has written down what the heck that means. It's spread across Titles 10 and 38 and a couple others. But that's why we have Congress. You have these people that come together to figure out what is needed for the times that we're in. The constitutional language is really about the underlying general direction that the federal government should be going in, and then it's up to mostly Congress to figure out how to get there. The other thing is that the Constitution has been largely unchanged, not entirely, but largely unchanged since 1789, right? Or 1788. And some of those provisions to raise and support armies or whatever else are perfectly applicable for today. They were perfectly applicable in 1800. A constitutional provision should last for all time to come and be relevant to the changes that you can and cannot foresee. And so that's why you want it to be fairly vague. And then the statutory constructs that are built on top of that foundation, those are the things that can adjust as the needs of the country change. An army in 1832, just to pick a random date, is very different from the army of today. We've got drones, we've got all kinds of stuff that weren't even imaginable at that time. And you know what? Congress, through the Armed Services Committees and Appropriations and Intel, they figure out pretty well what we need to do to be competitive around the world in terms of our military force structure. And so that's the same exact principle that should apply to fiscal management. We have actually lots of statutes governing that. We don't really need to have something that is super disciplined and specific in the Constitution because it would quickly become outdated as the needs of the country change, and then it would undermine the respect for the provision. Whereas if you have something pretty vague right now, think about the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. Well, what does that mean? Well, people say it over and over again, and they have specific ideas about what they mean by that, and it puts members of Congress a little bit on the defensive when they're perceived as doing something that's contrary to that. So if Congress is like blatantly not balancing the budget, then people are going to take them to task and they're going to have the Constitution on their side. So you don't actually need more than a principle. And actually, the more complicated it is, the harder it is for people to push back on the politicians for not living up to the principle, because they can find some legal ways of dancing around it rather than confronting the substance of it.
Right. And the idea that you have the ideas that are in the Constitution are principles that are applicable for a long time. The power of the federal government to create an army and a navy. That was written at a time when there were a lot of political philosophers that thought there shouldn't even be standing armies and navies.
That's right. Yeah.
Yet
Congress has power. It doesn't mean Congress must raise and
Yes.
support armies. It just said they could, right?
No, but it just means that over time, when the world has changed so much, when every other country of any size does, in fact, of course, have a standing army and navy, that we didn't hit a roadblock somewhere in the middle of the 19th century and become unable to defend ourselves, which we might have if we had had a very specific, narrowly written, army and navy raising clause in the Constitution. So I want to get back to something you mentioned about why would members of Congress themselves want to do this? I feel like there's a lot of populist across the political spectrum. I think you could even say there's left-wing populists as well as right-wing populists who are angry at the federal government for spending too much or putting us too much in debt. But there's this kind of populist way of looking at it, which is those crooks in Washington, D.C. are spending too much money, or maybe they're taxing us too much, or both. And it's us, we the people with pitchforks are yelling at them to do the right thing. But of course, there might be any number of reasons why members of Congress themselves think this is the right thing to do. They don't have to be forced to do it. And certainly the members who have sponsored previous attempts at balanced budgets, we would certainly assume at least they're in that category. So, a new requirement to balance the budget would restrain members of Congress, if it worked, in how they spend and what programs they're able to approve. So for that reason, you'd say, oh well, they wouldn't want to go for it. But like you said, one previous proposal failed by only one vote, right? So plenty of members of Congress do want to vote for it and have voted for it in the past. What combination of it do you think that they are? They're scared of the voters with the pitchforks who are mad at them, and how much is they just want Congress to work themselves? No one wants. The argument is no one wants Congress to work better than them. They have to deal with it every day.
That's right. Yeah, I think there's a number of different motivations at play. Members of Congress don't want to be the ones holding the bag if we get into a debt crisis. I think it's probably more of a when than an if, but I don't know when, and nobody really does. Historically, it turns out that whoever's in power when the crises come tend to get punished by the voters. We saw that after the 2008 crisis, and we've seen it a number of different times. But yeah, there are a lot of members on both sides of the aisle that believe in fiscal responsibility, that think that revenue and spending should be commensurate, not so tightly bound as annual balance would require, where spending and revenue would have to be the same every year. The issue there is that revenue is just so bouncy, so volatile, that if you try to tie spending to it, it would just be messy. But the idea of tying the trends of spending and revenue together, it's an intuitive thing. There's a lot of members of Congress that were state legislators or local government officials or governors or ran businesses. So it's an intuitive thing. The people, like you said before, it's a 70-80% issue for a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The desire for deficit reduction, for sound finances, for avoiding the inflation and high interest rates, those are all kind of churning around. And during the Tea Party era, we had the political willingness. We had the process wasn't really an obstacle. We know what the process is for constitutional amendments, but what we didn't have were mature, well-vetted proposals, not just for BBAs, but across the board. And I was working for a freshman member of Congress starting in January 2011, and we put together what's called the Business Cycle Balanced Budget Amendment, and we actually developed pretty broad support. A bunch of Republicans, I think we had 45 Republican co-sponsors and 14 Democratic co-sponsors, including some progressives like Jim Moran from Arlington and Alexandria, Jared Polis, who's now governor of Colorado, and a couple of others. But what we couldn't do that year was displace the traditional balanced budget amendment with annual balance. Then it was Congressman Goodlatte. He became chairman of Judiciary sometime after that. But, great guy. He'd been building support for this for a number of years. And that was the one that ultimately got the vote. Justin Amash and I believed then, and I still believe, that if we had been able to get the business cycle balance budget amendment to have a vote, then it would have passed with somewhere between 70 and 75% of the House, and then probably would have gone to the Senate. Some headwinds from Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who knows? But it's really about timing, and it's also about members having the idea that it will be achievable, and it will be achievable at an acceptable political cost. Doesn't mean that there can't be any political cost or that it has to be all upside, but they want to do the responsible thing, most of them. Again, they don't know how to do it and survive. But if you can make that possible for them, then I think they'd be willing to do it, especially if we're under pressure from, the bond markets getting wobbly, China looking like they might dump a bunch of our debt, and they still own like $800 billion. So we've got some vulnerability there. And especially if we've got a recurrence of inflation and interest rates are high and people aren't buying houses until they're 40 on average, like all these different things can come together. Probably we're not quite there this year. Mm-hmm. It will probably take a couple of years, but the reason I wrote the book is because it's going to take some time to rebuild the case, rebuild the bipartisan consensus, and so that when the time is right, again, hopefully we'll have all the good things or enough of the good things on the shelf and ready to go so Congress can just pull them off and plug them in, and then Congress can solve problems.
That's an optimistic view. I like that. Looking at some of the vote totals for big policies like this in the past is interesting because I think a lot of them, it sort of seems to ping pong between very tightly partisan ones, where the vote is extremely close, because in modern times we have a pretty closely divided House when either party has been in charge. Or everyone decides that they're just going to go all in and things pass by like ridiculously lopsided, majorities, including, one dissenter, like the one person who's the skunk decides not to vote for
like
it
my old boss.
for whatever reasons. So it really seems like in the latter case, if you have, whether it's every member just decided to get on the same page, or the two leaderships in the caucuses, decided to herd people together, that like if we all jump together, no one can use this vote against us on a partisan basis.
Yeah.
Right. And that sort of makes things easier. Mm-hmm. Right. If you assuming it's a good idea in the first place, an important caveat, but the problem with the sort of partisanship is not that each party is defending a high-minded, rigorously defined set of principles. The problem is there are no principles, and it's just partisanship versus partisanship, and that I feel like there's so many potentially good ideas that got poisoned along the way because they got perceived to be, oh, that's a Democrat thing, or that's a Republican thing. Mm-hmm. Therefore, half of each House of Congress immediately says, oh, well, I don't even need a legislative assistant to review that for me because I already heard it's a Dem thing or an R thing. Right. So we're already voting against it. So don't even bother. And so, getting, and certainly high poll numbers help, but getting to the point where you get to that tipping point where it's like, okay, well, most of us are already for this, and we might as well hold hands and jump together and bear the political cost together. That way, no one, you can't say, oh, well, you sided with the Republicans. It's like, well, no, we all voted together, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Democratic leader Steny Hoyer actually testified to the House Budget Committee a few years back about how we need to have a way to hold hands and jump together to right the fiscal ship. And so that's the logic behind the Fiscal Commission. We'll have, some number of Democrats, some number of Republicans, and then a majority or maybe a qualified majority or supermajority of them will say, hey, we're going to do these set of things, and then we're going to do it together, and that's how we're going to make it work. Okay, maybe, but there's some scholarship that commissions don't work very well unless there are like specific things in play, which we don't have right now. It's like healthy politics, and I don't remember what the other factors are, but we certainly don't have healthy politics right now. But there's a different approach to commissions that has a lot of promise. And, we have a commission that already exists. It's called Congress. Mm-hmm. And they have mini commissions called committees, and there are many commissions called subcommittees that have specific areas that they can work on. And so the question is, how do you empower the mini committees and then like the full committee to actually manage everything across the way, hold hands and jump together on different pieces? The most compelling answer is a comprehensive congressional budget, which is just a best practice that the most effective governments already do. And the idea is just to do a budget with everything in it, all spending, all revenue. And then like if you're on the subcommittee on like select revenue measures on Ways and Means, and you've got some tax stuff you want to do, you get together, Republicans and Democrats, you say, hey, what can we agree on? You do a thing, you push it into the full committee bill. Meanwhile, the health subcommittee is making their deal, and there's a lot of waste in healthcare programs right now, so there's lots of room for improvement. And so these things could bubble up from the subcommittee to the full committee, from the full committee to the budget bill that goes to the floor, and then everybody's holding hands and jumping together at each step along the way, ideally. And so it makes it really hard to attack, the Social Security solvency extension or whatever that is in the budget bill, because you're taking shots at your people as well as the other side's people. Mm-hmm. And the problems that we have are partly because there's been an agglomeration of power and decision-making by leadership, which has created this bipolar system where there's the Republican position and the Democrat position. And like there's basically like a no man's land where, at least on high salience issues, bipartisan negotiating is not encouraged. So we need a way to push the policymaking decisions to the committees and the subcommittees where they belong, where the expertise exists and where the bargaining can happen, rather than like from the leadership bipolar discussions that we've become accustomed to. But that's not how a legislature should work. It should be a very flat organizational structure. You put people on committees based on their interests, their aptitudes, balancing different ideologies, regions, all that kind of thing. And then they figure out where they agree and how they can move the country forward. And it's a challenge process where you're looking across different things. So we need to be thinking about moving away from the leadership-centric model to a more committee-empowered model. Leadership will still have really important roles in a committee-centric model, and probably they'd be actually fulfilling a better version of their comparative advantage rather than trying to do what leadership actually needs to do, plus what committees are for. It's just a rebalancing of roles and responsibilities that we need, and the comprehensive budget's a big part of that, which would in turn make it more possible for Congress to reach and persist in balancing the budget.
Yeah, so obviously we're focusing a lot on Congress because Congress would have to sort of pass an amendment, but then also be bound by the provisions of the amendment. Mm-hmm. And come up with their own enabling legislation for the details. But you talk about something, and we'll wrap up here because I think this is the most kind of like fun blue sky version of this. That the Constitution provides two ways for a constitutional amendment to come into force. So the House and Senate can approve it by 2/3 majorities, and then 3/4 of the state legislature, sort of up to each state legislature to decide if they want to take it up and pass it, as happened many times, with some of our best and least favorite constitutional amendments over the years. But we could also have a system of conventions, something we've never seen before, but is for political theory nerds. This is a sort of like exciting idea that like a bunch of well-intentioned citizens can come together and declare a convention or petition a convention, or, well, how would this work exactly?
Yeah, well, we don't entirely know because we haven't had a convention of states, but we do have some indications as to how it would work. There's an interesting book that talks about the conventions that made America, and it's the kind of the early settlement through revolutionary period conventions that existed between the different states. I think the author's name is Mike Capek, and yeah, the founders were very familiar with this process. Basically, the idea, the constitutional provision says that 2/3 of both houses of Congress can propose amendment, or when 2/3 of state legislatures have applied to Congress for a convention to propose amendments, then Congress shall call one. It's not discretionary; they have to do it. So before we talk about the mechanics of how they would work, let's talk about kind of the prospects for maybe getting there. I used to think that you would have to have 2/3 of states applying for the same general theme of amendments, but I've gone back and read Article 5, and it's pretty clear to me now that once 2/3 of states have applied for a convention of any sort for any topic, then Congress is duty-bound under the language of the Article 5 of the Constitution to convene the convention. And there's an Article 5 project that has gone back and looked at all of the different applications that are outstanding. I do talk about this in the book. And they believe that state legislatures have passed that threshold in 1979, and then it stayed above that threshold for another 8 or 9 years. So their contention now, and they've been involved with litigation to try to get the Supreme Court to say that Congress has been derelict in its duty to call the convention and thereby force one into being. How one would take place, each state legislature would send its delegates. It is strongly believed that each state's delegation would have one vote. It's a convention of states after all. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really matter how many people came from each state. That state would have one voice, just like every other state. And then if a majority of state delegations approved proposing a specific amendment, then it would go out to the states. And then there's two paths of ratification. There's either for the state legislatures to approve 3/4 of them, or for 3/4 or conventions in 3/4 of the states. Now, we actually do know what that looks like because prohibition was repealed through state conventions. The 21st Amendment was approved that way, even though it originated with Congress. My reading of Article 5 is that Congress decides the mode of ratification, whether the amendment is proposed by Congress or from a convention. Other people think that the conventioneers would be able to decide. So that's a point of unclarity. But I guess big picture, I haven't given up on Congress. This is the institution that I know and love and wish it would work a lot better for the American people. It needs to get out of the way in many cases. But it is full of talented people, bright people that are stuck in a dysfunctional system. And, if we do end up having a convention, yes, I'll engage them. Hopefully the book will be useful to those people as they're thinking about how to craft a balanced budget amendment that can get ratified and will make sense for the country and last for all time to come. But right now the focus is on getting Congress to fix itself. And I guess the push for the convention and maybe the reality of a convention could help Congress organize itself to actually get this done so that they don't have to worry about what state legislators might come up with.
Nice. Well, I think it should be held at a very nice hotel near an international airport, and I already know.
So Atlanta.
Yeah. Who should get up on stage with his TED Talk mic and give the keynote address? You right here.
It's very kind.
Keynote speaker at the Constitutional Convention of Conventions. So, Kurt, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for being with us. In addition to the book, of course, tell people where they can find all of your impressive work out there on the internet.
Well, I post all the things that I write to my LinkedIn page. I also talk about them and a whole lot of other things on my X. I'm the only Kurt Couchman that is active in budget policy, or really any policy as far as I know. So I'm pretty easy to find. And then, of course, I work for Americans for Prosperity. We have an active federal presence, and we're in all the 50 states and doing a lot of state and local policy as well. You can find us on americansforprosperity.org and our many, many social media channels as well.
All right. Fantastic. Remember, go out and buy this book, Fiscal Democracy in America. Thanks for being with us, Kurt.
It's been fun.